I actually surprised myself because I don't really believe in organized religion anymore, but I felt angry on behalf of my ancestry who have kept Judaism safe for 1500 years, that this kind of thing is happening and that these are the people with the microphone throughout not just Israel, but a lot of the Jewish world. And so actually it gave me weeks of sleepless nights when I got to that section of the film, editing it.
Welcome back to War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. My guest today, Gillian Mosely, is an award-winning documentarian whose recent film, Planet Israel, explores Israeli society during and after October 7th and how the very real history and experience of Jewish trauma has been used to justify inflicting trauma upon Palestinians. The documentary features a broad range of people, including the Begin Center spokesman who says life in the diaspora leads nowhere, the former soldier who calls the West Bank apartheid, and a woman in Gaza attending school on her smartphone in a tent. So thank you so much for joining me, Gillian.
Thank you, Orli, and congratulations on having the best podcast title ever.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I figured, yeah, there's no point in playing it coy anymore, eh? Just gotta be upfront. So tell me about how the documentary came to be. What did you think you were making a documentary about, and what did it become a documentary about?
So I made a film that came out in 2022 called The Tinderbox, which was about British Mandate Palestine and its impacts, its continuing impacts on the lives of Israelis and Palestinians today. And it was really a plea to end systemic othering. And it warned that if we don't address underlying issues, war will erupt again. And as I said, it came out in 2022 and 2023, there we were. When I made that film, I really thought it said everything that I had to say on the subject, because really we're talking about underlying patterns that started around 1915 and persist to this day. And, you know, they've just caused ever increasing problems. However, October the 7th happened, and then the Israeli response happened, and it was so much worse than anything any of myself or my immediate circle were expecting, that it made me feel really upset. And about 9 months later, Pew Research did a poll, and in it they asked Israelis whether they thought that the Israeli response to the war was too much about right or too little. And 73% of those Israelis polled replied that they thought that the response was either about right or too soft. And I had to wonder where that kind of an opinion came from, when by that point tens of thousands of people, mostly civilians, and a large portion of women and children had been killed. And so I decided to make a film about it. And we went to Israel approximately 1 year after October 7th and started making our film. And when we started, we thought, you know, what I thought I was investigating was Jewish trauma and victimhood and how it played into the aftermath of October the 7th. And I thought that that was probably going to be about 70% of the answer to my question, and about 30% of it would be political, down to the current politics of the country. And as I got into it, it just kept getting worse and worse, or darker and darker. Let's put it that way. So we had a really interesting first day. It took us a long time to fly into Tel Aviv. There were almost no flights. We had to go through Moldova, layover for quite a while. We arrived at our destination at 2 a.m. and at 6 a.m. we're on the road driving along the Gaza border to visit some kibbutzim who I'd been put in touch with. And these kibbutzim were Julia Chaitin, who is a social psychologist and was lucky enough that their kibbutz was not invaded on October the 7th. And then Avi Dabush, who is CEO of Rabbis for Human Rights, and his kibbutz was invaded. He had the presence of mind to run out and lock all their doors and shut all their window shutters and and their gate and make it look like they were away. And they were left alone, although they were listening to what had happened in their neighbor's house. And from there, we drove up to Jerusalem and we spied a small demonstration. So we stopped and did a vox pop. And that was with a gentleman who, they were protesting to bring the hostages home. But as it turned out, he was very left wing. And I turned to my camera woman at the end of this day and said, have the pollsters got us completely wrong? Everyone we've spoken to today is basically liberal. And the next day it started. And we went out and vox popped for several days and interspersed that with other interviews. And almost everyone else that we did vox pop was pro-war. And we were hearing things like, why would the Palestinians be afraid? I don't know what to believe. And we were also hearing an awful lot of people saying that they were pro-war but anti-Netanyahu. And all of this taken together, builds quite a strange picture, and a picture that probably a lot of people in the West are unfamiliar with. And some of it really only began to make sense when we were in the edit and we were doing continuing interviews. So we were there. We were supposed to be there for about 6 days, and my camera woman had to be back on a certain date. And on the 4th day, the Iranians bombed, and we ended up in a bomb shelter. And then the next morning, woke up in Jerusalem at 6 a.m., drove up to Tel Aviv to interview Professor Danny Bartal, and then drove out through Egypt. So it was all very biblical. And the situation was such that anytime we kind of thought about going back, it just wasn't going to happen. So all the other interviewees, bar 2, were done in the UK or Ireland. They're all Jewish. Many are also Israeli. And we had to send a camera crew back to do one interview, and I interviewed them on the phone. This is the former IDF soldier from Breaking the Silence. And the Gaza interviews, I briefed the team and they did the interviews on the ground.
Yes, how did those interviews come about? Because that was very powerful. And they were set up in a very important, powerful way in which you say the news media almost exclusively talks about Palestinians through numbers, barely ever names or faces. So we meet people who talk about the people they know themselves who had been killed. How did those interviews come about?
So again, it was an evolving thing. And the last 2 interviews that we booked were the IDF soldier and the interviews in Gaza. And those really came about as a result of the early editing and realizing what was missing from the film. I am a huge believer in vox popping people on the streets because I just feel you get a flavor of what's going on in the ground in a way that you just don't anywhere. And it just seemed obvious that, we'd spent a lot of time vox popping Israelis and really we needed to vox pop Gazans as well.
Yeah, something I found so interesting with the person on the street interviews was the broad range of accents from the people in Israel you talked to. Was that a deliberate choice, or did that just come about by the nature?
No. None of that was deliberate. I mean, I don't know if you've ever vox popped, but really you sort of stand on a street corner and stop anyone who looks vaguely open and ask if they will be interviewed. And in our case, asked if they were happy to talk a little bit in English. And that was really how it came. And we used everybody that we filmed.
Yeah, Americans love attention. You'll always be safe to find someone to talk to who's American Israeli. You set about to make a film about trauma, which you did, but it is also very much of a film about the media. Tell us about the media environment that Israelis were and I guess are living in?
So, as I said, people were saying things to us like, why would the Palestinians be scared? And I don't know what to believe. And, Danny Bartal had talked quite a lot about all the studies they did on brainwashing. And, these studies were done on kids in kindergarten. And, Danny talked about walking into a school in the suburbs of Tel Aviv, which is a liberal city, where his granddaughter was studying, and seeing on the wall a map of Greater Israel. And
For those who
he
don't know, what is the Greater Israel map?
so the Greater Israel map is a map which does not contain green lines, and the corollary to his story was that the children were being taught that the green lines were dissolved in the 1970s, and those green lines define the Palestinian territories. As I understand it, Greater Israel also includes bits of Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. So we're talking about quite a large swathe. As a history buff and someone who knows a lot about ancient history, I have to scratch my head. I don't really see where that comes from in terms of ancient history, but there we have it. So it was obvious that something was going on. And the one person that we were meant to interview who couldn't change the date of their interview, and as I said, we left early, my camera woman had to be home, was Gidon Levy. And we cast around to find someone to replace him, because at that stage, I certainly didn't know if I would get back. And I felt that was a voice that had been missing. And I emailed an academic I know, Maury Ram, who's at Newcastle. And I said, do you know anybody? And he came out with Ayala Paniewski, who turned out to be absolutely extraordinary. She's just written this amazing book about the new censorship. I think it's called The New Censorship. And it's really talking about the playbook that was enacted in Israel in order to take over the media and change the nature of the media in that country. And obviously, she is then also alluding to attempts to do similar things in the West. And I think it was frighteningly effective in Israel, if people are telling me they don't know what to believe anymore. But I think that in part that's because Israel is a much smaller country than the US or somewhere like the UK. So it's got a seventh of the number of people living in it as we do here in the UK, and America is obviously exponentially larger. However, it's all concerning. And that was really the interview that started me personally down quite a dark road in the edit. And I was just thinking, this is even worse than I thought it was, but it did get worse from there.
Yes, the film uses the authoritarian playbook as a structuring device. At what point did you think to compare Israel to an authoritarian state?
Unfortunately, I think that became obvious fairly early on. It was just one thing after another that was not, how do I put this, shouting democracy. In no way did any of these scenarios remind me of true democratic values, which of course Israel thinks it holds. So it really was a combination of, knowing what Jewish trauma is and the effect it can have. In my opinion, it's a choice for most people, because you can overcome it, because I've done it myself. However, according to the Israeli state comptroller, something like 40% of Israelis have PTSD. That is a shocking amount. So you think about all these traumatized people and how vulnerable they are to certain kind of messaging. And that was really the kickoff point. And then you've got Danny talking about the studies he's done about the Israeli education system and its real sort of brainwashing for militarization, which then continues into the army. Then you've got Ayala talking about the media takeover and, eventually the fact that Hebrew-speaking media is reporting almost nothing about Gazan civilian casualties. So all of that had already taken me down the authoritarian road when I got to what had happened to the religion. And that is something, I mean, it's funny when you meet people who sort of shrug their shoulders and go, well, didn't you know that? Well, no, I didn't know that. So I read a book by Michael Mannequin called The End of Days while I was editing, because I wanted to do a section on the Jewish split. And I really thought the Jewish split was about the rising number, particularly of young Jews who are, I'll put it this way, non-Zionist. And then I read The End of Days, which is about religious Zionism and the rise of religious Zionism. And religious Zionism really comes in the contemporary era out of Brooklyn-born Rabbi Meir Kahane, who was a convicted terrorist both in the US and in Israel. And it's built on his words, his teachings. Other people have added to it. And hey presto, religious Zionism seems to have become quite a big religious movement. And with religious Zionists and settlers, we're probably talking about quite a small population of Israel. But when you add to that the fact that, as Ayala says, settler movements have gone out to take over. She talks about the politics particularly, but also the media particularly, but also the politics. And then you see how the militarization and education system has fed into this. It gives a very dark picture of the prevailing winds in Israel. And I don't know if anyone's told you, but I actually am descended from a lot of famous rabbis, and I've got them in 3 or 4 different bits of my lineage, but particularly a Sephardi family. I'm part of a Sephardi family that goes back arguably 1200 or 1500 years.
Wow.
And includes an awful lot of famous rabbis and cantors and philosophers and military heads and dayanim. And I actually surprised myself because I don't really believe in organized religion anymore, but I felt angry on behalf of my ancestry who have kept Judaism safe for 1500 years, that this kind of thing is happening and that these are the people with the microphone throughout not just Israel, but a lot of the Jewish world. And so actually it gave me weeks of sleepless nights when I got to that section of the film editing it.
Yes, I feel like that's similar to the origin story of this podcast, is quite literally trying to, if I can't take the microphone away from them, then I could at least buy my own and try to broadcast a better, less destructive Jewish culture to the world, to YouTube. I'd love to hear more about your lineage and about the British Jewish experience. I had the honor. I did comedy in London in the summer of 2022, and I waltzed in all smug because I'm like, oh, I'm a New York comedian. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. But I learned quickly in London that is not the case with Jewish jokes. That the salience of just je ne sais quoi in pop culture does not exist in the UK. Is that safe to say? Like, you only recently got Seinfeld.
You know what? I don't know
Yeah.
is the answer. Yeah, I may not be the right person to ask. Things have gotten very touchy here in a really unbelievably unhelpful way that I think is completely counterproductive. So yeah, I'm not sure what your reception would have been to Jewish jokes. Were you in mainly Jewish audiences?
I was just in Camden cabarets. So I quickly then started doing jokes about how much I'm bombing, and then started educating the people what a bris is. I was surprised that, people didn't even know a bris. And then a heckler told me that men in the UK aren't even circumcised.
Yeah, no, we're often not. So I think here, if you've been in a Jewish space, it might have been different, but a lot of people have been silenced. And this is really why I have been making these films, because it cannot be that this stuff doesn't get get said.
Yeah, thank you for saying it. And it's also important the role Britain plays in the history of the Middle East. One thing that I learned from Planet Israel was the Jewish community's response to the Balfour Declaration, how British Jews in the early 20th century did not take to Zionism.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other topic, and it's gone into in more depth in the Tinderbox. But Zionism was not universally popular among Jews. And actually, Molly Crabapple's book is talking about a counter movement at the same time. I don't probably need to tell you that the story of the Balfour Declaration is really a story of layer upon layer upon layer of racism, because, the Brits were very happy to get rid of their Jews. And there was a piece of correspondence quoted in Tom Segev's book, One Palestine Complete, between the aide of President Wilson, and he's quoting Balfour and basically saying that, the Brits and the Americans are happy to get rid of their pesky Jews who have Bolshevik tendencies. Oh. So it's quite a statement. And I think we have to remember that in the West, that was possibly the prevailing statement. But the Sephardim particularly have been in Britain for a very long time. So I have an ancestor who was supposedly a lay preacher in the 1600s. I have an ancestor who was one of the earliest chief rabbis at Bibi Synagogue, which still exists. And he arrived there in 1795 from Italy. Then his son-in-law is also my great-great-great-grandfather, and he translated the Sephardi prayer book into English for the first time, and wrote several hymns, and was actually, he's a real name in the Sephardi world, and on that lineage went. So by the time Montague, who was a distant relative, and of course, lots of British Jews of a certain caste intermarried.
Is this the same Montague of Operation Mincemeat?
I don't know, actually. But he was in the India office, and he was one of, I think it was 3 cabinet ministers at the time who was Jewish. And no, he was the only Jewish cabinet minister, and he was the one who fulsomely objected to the Balfour Declaration on the basis that it would make Jews less comfortable in these countries where they'd striven so hard to fit in. It's a long document, and in it he says an awful lot of things that have basically come true. And that's the thing about that period, and this is something I went into in the Tinderbox. There was warning upon warning that there would be problems if this went ahead. But I also have ancestors who were early Zionists, mostly in Canada, in Montreal. So D.A. de Sola's eldest son went to lead the synagogue in Montreal and was a scholar and rabbi and opened Congress. He was the first British rabbi to open Congress. And his sons were both Zionists, not necessarily, I like to think that if they'd seen how Zionism played out, it might have given them pause, because of course, Zionism at the time meant 100 different things. And it just so happens that it is the harshest form of Zionism, Ze'ev Jabotinsky's Religious Zionism. That is what has played out. So, if someone supported Zionism 150 years ago, that could have meant something very different.
And the documentary demonstrates just how direct a line it is between Netanyahu and Jabotinsky. Like, what is both the ideological and personal connection?
Absolutely. And, that's something that Avi Schleim talks about quite a lot. And coming across the quote by Ben Zion, who didn't die that long ago.
Who's Bibi's dad, for those who don't know.
Who's Bibi's dad, and clearly had a huge effect on his son, who's still quoting Jabotinsky, a couple of years ago. So it's very, putting those building blocks together, it's actually quite easy. The steps are all there, and it tells us a huge amount. So if you add up Jabotinsky and Meir Kahane, where we are today is where we get, is where you get. And I really have a question about to any practicing Jew, is this really what Judaism is all about? Because it's certainly not a Judaism that I sign up to. But you also have to remember that, in history, there have been breakaway militant groups periodically. And it does make me laugh because inevitably they have ended up on the scrap heap and, caused all sorts of problems for Jews. So quite why they think that this time will be different, I don't know.
Yeah, how does it keep proliferating? Like, what is our role in the West to try and either change the track or yeah, oi.
But I think it gets to the heart of what your
Mhm.
podcast is about. I mean, war takes us in circles, and every single example in history tells us this. And yet here we are. And, I was listening somewhat gleefully to your piece on World War I, which I happen to have made a 3-part series about.
Oh, fantastic.
And
Thank you.
And intellectually, it's a fascinating war, but it's a study in a situation which step by step never needed to develop. And, I feel the same about Israel and Palestine. And, there are so many opportunities to stop and listen and assess. And these seem to have been thrown away every time. And, as humanity, can we learn from constant failure of war that this doesn't work and we need to do something else?
The inability to even have the discussion has been interesting. Here in the US, we're talking about the UK and how they recently banned Hassan Piker, the left-wing commentator, from entering. Does that help challenge perceptions and conspiracy theories about Jewish power?
So the thing to note about Hassan Piker is that they have also, to be fair, been banning right-wing people from entering the UK. Personally, do I think we should be banning anyone? Not really, unless they are an indicted war criminal. Netanyahu, well, not yet indicted, but arrest warrants out. I'd like to see people like that, well, arrested. But, we have quite a hardline foreign secretary here at the moment, who is also Muslim, and I think probably for that reason is more hardline than she might otherwise be. And this is what we get. I mean, I understand the Oxford Union is going to carry on with its debate, which is great. So, they won't have succeeded there. But, we're in a really strange place. And, Britain has had a number of things going on which are restrictive. But I think what this all really speaks to is overwhelming success of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which was worked on very hard by loads of pro-Israel and probably Israel-backed groups for years, which conflated the definitions of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and has, to my mind, backfired stupendously because nobody knows what. It's made a mockery of anti-Semitism. The phrase anti-Semitism, and genuine anti-Semitism is happening, but because it's been conflated with anti-Zionism, attention gets pulled away from genuine anti-Semitism and put onto anti-Zionism. And we're going to end up in a situation where the boy cried wolf. So, we're probably already there.
Did you see the play Giant? The Tony Awards are on Sunday, so thinking about theater, but that's about Roald Dahl, famous British icon, and his anti-Semitism, which was objectively anti-Semitism, but he was kind of pushed into it because people were telling him, oh, you're anti-Israel, that means you're anti-Semitic. So he just took it and ran with it. He's like, okay, you say that, fine, I agree. So
I haven't seen it, but that sounds, I don't know if it's on, but
yeah,
here, but
it transferred to Broadway, but hopefully you can read it, or I can only imagine like any great piece of theater that makes money, they'll turn it into a film. But I'm interested in learning a bit more about contemporary Britain and particularly in how can we fight this. So in your movie, we explore how media and popular conversation got us into this mess. Is that the same strategy we can use to get out?
I don't know. I mean, I feel we're in a a really dark time in terms of politics and media. And I think what's happening, probably here and in the US, is that the combination of the facts on the ground and popular opinion have really turned. And we're closing in on a tipping point where, people do not believe that Israel is an ally. People do, support Palestine over Israel, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not sure I believe, it has to be an either or in that sense, but politicians need to catch up with the fact that the fact and popular opinion say the Palestinians have been appallingly treated and this needs to be rectified. So, whatever we're doing with Israel is irrelevant in a way. For me, the prime goal is allowing the Palestinians their rights and dignities and, dealing with what's happened and admitting what's happened. I mean, it amazes me that most countries have yet to admit their colonial meanderings, certainly Britain included, and the damage that's caused. And, we're constantly in this society blaming the victims, which astonishes me. In America, obviously, slavery dragged a number of Africans onto American shores. And now, those people are blamed because, I don't know, they're not white when they didn't want to be there in the first place. So, and Palestinians' land was taken. We just, we can't allow that to land. But with the media here, it's really interesting, the mainstream media, what is and isn't getting through. And to me, the most full-on thing that has made it onto mainstream TV here on the BBC was Louis Theroux's film about the settler movement, which was, less than an hour long and spent a lot of time with Daniela Weiss. And for mainstream television was unbelievably laudable. And, boy, am I thrilled that that was on. But, in the same breath, the BBC then turned around and wouldn't show the medics in Gaza film. And there are a group of Jews, well-meaning, no doubt, who make a virtue alongside lawyers for Israel of basically threatening almost anyone who is trying to say something that they don't want to hear. If you're someone like the BBC, unfortunately, they seem to have allowed themselves to fall foul of that, not least because one of the key people doing this is called Danny Cohen, and he used to be a key figure at the BBC. There have been complaints about the blurbs about my film at some of the cinemas that we're due to be showing at. And I'm waiting to see whether protesters will turn up at any of these, who I'll be filming because, of course, it's unlikely that they'll have seen the film, so I can have some fun with that.
Yes.
I think with someone like me, let's see what happens. It's much harder to call somebody, especially with a lineage like mine, anti-Semitic. So, let's see how this goes.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you for powering through, given the threats and how it's uncomfortable and unpopular telling people what they don't want to hear. But how else could anything change?
I've been writing to The Guardian and The Times about this for a year. The Jewish Policy Research Group, which is basically a social policy research organization, quite, just down the middle. Their last poll showed that almost 40% of Jews have lowered their attachment to Israel in the last couple of years. And yet none of our media has reported this. And the Jews are still in this country being treated by the media as a monolith. You can't say that most Jews are scared when 40 have looked at this situation and gone, no thanks. And I for me, that is itself fueling anti-Semitism, because if you present a monolith, then you're going to get a response to a monolith. So, but, I think the answer is that we just all have to club together. And, I do I'm hyper aware that I'm not Palestinian and I cannot speak for Palestinians. And, there are things that I would probably like to say, but don't feel it's my place to say. And so, we've also got to navigate that situation as well. But at the end of the day, we're all pushing for the same thing. And yeah, I guess more cooperation is what I'd like to see happening.
I'm glad you said that. Yes, it is fueling anti-Semitism, presenting anyone as a monolith, but especially a monolith that doesn't even deny being responsible for at least 70,000 deaths. The people who claim to represent Jews that are defending this are putting targets on our back in that regard. And we see it happen on the ground in the UK. It's not a hypothetical anymore.
This will get to a point where all this stuff can no longer be ignored. And let's hope that happens before much more destruction has occurred, because of course that's the deadline, as it were, that we're up against. And they're going so quickly, one wonders if there is even going to be any Palestinian land by the time Netanyahu and co are finished.
Where can people see Planet Israel?
So the best thing to do is to go to our website, which is www.planetisrael.co.uk. And on there, for people in all of the Americas, so North, Central, South America, as well as Israel, Palestine, and Australia, is a kinema link where you can rent the film and where you can also rent the film for screenings, public screenings. For people in the UK, we're doing a cinema run, which starts this weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been an absolute delight to talk to you.
Thank you for listening and or watching War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. Please subscribe, rate and review, tell your dads. We'll see you next time.